Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So here is a tutorial about inheritance. Let's try to cover this tutorial and see if we can answer the questions here. It covers several aspects of object-oriented programming as well, but basically the idea is to teach you more about inheritance, to apply more about inheritance. So here is a scenario. It says here Gadda Doctors is a small clinic newly opened at Male. The clinic system contains the following logic. So it has given you the basic logic of the system, and it says each patient has a patient ID, first name, last name, ID card number, address, date of birth, and his account and user and password. So this is an example of a patient class. Immediately you know the patient class, and you also know the variables in the class. So it's easy for you to create the constructors, getters, headers, and the toString method for this class. So other classes, staffs at the clinic are also added to the system. Each staff will have a name, ID card number, date of birth, address, name, and username, password, and a date of joining the clinic. Doctors have the following attributes: ID card number or ID foreigners names. So if it is a person who is from another country, they have some kind of ID. So we call this as ID, right? Name, address, date of joining clinic, and also specialty, room number, if there is a room number. Okay, assuming that the fixed rooms are assigned. So if the doctors have rooms, in this scenario they have rooms. A doctor writes prescription to the patient based on their diagnosis. Each prescription should have following properties. So you are you immediately know there's a class called staff class, doctor class, prescription class, and then it says prescription ID, patient ID, diagnostic medicine, and so in fact for all these IDs you can just use ID instead of saying prescription ID, staff ID. Just call it ID. Addresses of patients are kept separately in the database. So addresses of patients are kept separate in the database. They have the following attributes. That means the patient's address is a separate class itself: address ID, email, phone number, house name, and also address. So the reason why it has given this field is because sometimes you might have an address ID with email and phone number and also house name as because the same the address itself is a little bit lengthier, so we have a separate table here for just for addresses. When an appointment is made, the following details are required. So what does it mean? There's a separate class called appointment. So appointment ID, staff ID, mean the staff who added to it, and then patient ID, doctor ID, date of the appointment, and time set for the consultation. So this is an appointment, right? So basically this is the setup, the scenario here. And what are the classes such a system would contain if made using Java? What attributes will those classes have? Very easy, because you have been given them. For example, you can say there is a class called patient class, there's a class called staff class, and also there is a class called doctor class. Then there's a class called prescription class, address class, appointment class, and easily you can see there are variables here. One of the things you have to derive, you have to understand from the scenario is, you look at here an example of a patient. For example, the patient itself, you see, it says first name, ID, last name, ID card number, address, and also they have a date of birth. Additionally, if you look at this one, it says here address is part of the patient. So you know that the patient, they have another field called address ID, for example. So those kind of things you have to remember. This is something you have to derive from the scenario. Okay, so in this case, don't create the coding, just list the required details. That's how you get the 5 marks. So you can just mention those details here. And the second question, it says here, according to this scenario, we can use inheritance. Okay, so we can use inheritance to minimize the coding and create a structure for the system. Draw and show such a structure would look like. Show where inheritance are used. Okay, so it has also 5 marks. So you can understand from here all of these classes. See, for example, in fact all of these classes have what we call as an ID, and then they have other details such as, see, for example, patients have, and staffs and doctors, all of them have first name, last name. We don't need to use first name, last name. We can just make a name called name. The reason why we have a last name and first name separately is because some people from foreign countries, they actually have a separate first name, last name, which is something formal for them. In our case, we actually have one name, but you can divide your name into 2 parts and make that as first name, last name. And so those things that are common, like for example, ID, name, last name, first name, even the staffs have them. And also address, patient has address, so yeah, you can use address ID, of course. Then staff will have a name ID, and also they have date of birth, they also have date of birth, and username, password. See, so all these details that the patient is having actually belongs to the general class called person class. So every person in this architecture has these kind of details, right, which every other person also has. And additionally the staffs have date that they joined the clinic, you know. And also if you look at the doctors, they also have date of joining the clinic, and so which means they are employee. So you can actually have a scenario where you can say, you have to draw a diagram, of course. In this scenario you can actually create a diagram using Microsoft Word with some um, example scenario for uh, squares. Just use squares. So here you can say, you can just give the answer by going through this one and creating a scenario. So first of all, we have one of the things I'll do is I'll open up Paint, because I like to use draft drawing instead of drawing it in the formal way. We definitely need to have a class called person, so we are going to have a person class. Here you can say person class. What does this person class has? So this person class, let's drag this a little bit up. This person class has several variables, which are what the patient has. See, ID, so we use ID, first name, last name, and ID card number. In this case, ID card number refers to identification. The patient has it, the staff has it, the doctors even has it. So ID card number. Address, does the doctors have address? Yes, they also have address. This is not really an address, it's an address ID, and the address table has the details. Here you can see the address of the patient. It says the address of the patients. So what we will do here is we will just use the address table only for patients, because that's what it is mentioned here. So for the doctors and the staff, they have the address, which is a separate field. Okay, so we can easily say there's a person class, and the person class has ID, first name, last name, ID card number. And here it says ID card number, and in case of doctors it says ID. So ID card number or ID. So what we will do is we will just call it as identification, right? So there it will be either an ID card number, or it will be either a foreign cards workers permit ID or something like that. And then so let's have a class here called person that we need to have, and it's going to have ID, username, password until everything like this. And we are going to rename the ID, first name, last name. Here we call this ID card number, we call it identification number, because that is common. Identification number, you know. Of course in the programming you have to give underscores or camel case underscores, or you have to give one variable. You can't use spaces. We are just giving them hypothetically instead of and everyone has an address. See? Person, even the patients have an address. Is in the patient class, the address field will have the ID, where you'll go into the ID field and get the details. As for the other people, of course, they have their own address field, but to make it common, we have address. So the address field is in the person class. Then we have date of birth, account, username, password. So date of birth, username, password, right? So this is an example of what we call as the details that the patients have, not just patients, person. So this is the parent class of all the classes. So we have this scenario where we have the person class having these details. Let's paste it here. Okay, so you would want, oh sorry, we'll just grab a little text field and paste them here. It's better, make them a little bit bigger, so by giving it a font of 16. Yeah, so this is the person class. Now that means my patient class is going to have little bit less details. So you can see here patient has a patient ID, first name, last name, address, date of birth. Everything in the person is there in the patient class, so it just extends the person. So this extends person. Okay, so what does that mean? That means I can have a patient class directly below the class, and that means I can just have another class called patient. Okay, so this is the patient class and it has the same variables as the person class, and you will actually draw a small arrow there. So in this case we will just use this arrow here, sorry, this kind of arrows, right? You could actually draw a more flexible arrow by having it, where's the side arrow? You don't have a side arrow, right? Anyway, just use this. So the patient class inherits from the person class. Then you have the staff class, which is name, id, date of birth, address, username, password, and the date of joining, you know. So the date of joining, so what happens here is when you call it staff, doctors are also staff, but they are a different type of staff, you know. So what we will do is we will create a separate class called employee down here, employees of the company. So it's a clinic, they have employees, so employee, and this staff id becomes employee id. So even the doctor has that id, which is called the employee id, which is used as the person id here. So that is there actually, but in addition you have date of joining. So here you will have this additional field called date of joining. Okay, so date of joining as the additional field here, which is uh, another class that is inheriting from the person class, of course. Okay, then you have to remove all these things. So staff directly extends from, so you have employee class here, employee, of course. Remember, you have the diagram is what is important, how you take the draft is not important. Employee with all those details that we just said, which is date of joining the college. So this goes here, and my staff class just extends, it extends employee, thereby it has all the details. And the doctors themselves, the staffs and doctors are different people, so we have to have a class called staff here, down here, staff class, and this is the staff class. Then you have a staff class which is extending from the employee class, right? Then you have the doctors class, which is doctors also have an id and they have a name, address, joining the class. They have additional fields, look at this. Okay, so you have a specialty and a room number given to them. So we have to have a separate class here called doctors class, and of course they have more details, which is, this is the doctors, right? And they have specialty and room number, two additional things here. And so let's add that information into the doctors class. Let's give it a value of 18, 20 maybe. So doctors have specialty and a room number, and they are also inheriting from the employee class. So you have to have this line where you have to show where the doctors are inheriting from. Alright, now we can see from this diagram, a doctor writes a prescription, so there is no other inheritance scenario here. So when we have a prescription class, there's nothing common in the prescription class, and address itself is a separate class, and there is nothing that can be common. Appointment itself is a separate class, there's nothing common here. So outside my scenario I have the person class. In addition to my person class, I have other classes which doesn't relate to these things, but I have to draw it for completion, which is address first. Okay, there's a class called address. Then I have my appointment, oh sorry, prescription as well. So let's have another class here called prescription. It's just a class and it doesn't prescription, and then I have to drag it here. Let me just prescription, and then you have this class called appointment. And of course don't forget about the details. Address class has everything here in the have the address id, and basically it is also getting this id from the person class, but we don't want to do that because person class has more details. So it's just the details like this. And when it says something important here, you can see here address has email, phone number, and house name. Do they have email? Email is added as address field. Okay, so address becomes a separate entity inside the person class. Okay, remember that. So address becomes an entity in the person class. So address class is a separate class which has those details. In the patient, here you will have to have uh, here in the person class you have to have that address. Where is it? There it is, address. So address is a separate class and it has those details, so you can actually add them just for completion. And these things, okay, remember they are the same thing. I just make it small. Prescription class has prescription ID, patient ID, diagnosis. So yeah, okay, so let's have our sorry, we already have it, right? These are the details in the prescription. Okay, so it's too small. Just have an idea. Okay, you just have make sure that you understand what's happening here. Patient ID, all these things are part of the prescription class. And the last is appointment, which so appointment has appointment ID, staff ID, patient ID, doctor ID, and when the date, when the appointment is, and also time. So that's like date time, so what is that? Appointment ID. So let's grab another table here, and this is also separate item altogether. And then you can have prescription, no, appointment, and the appointment has these classes. Again, these are many things, so make sure you, sorry, that's not the proper way to do it. Just paste it here. Yeah, those are the details. Anyway, so this is the scenario. So and then when the question was asking to you to create an inheritance scenario, it's expecting you to create an answer like that. By using this scenario, you just have to grab these details and paste it to show the inheritance hierarchy. So you can just copy this and then paste it here. So even in the exam you can produce drafts like this. This is acceptable as long as you have these lines drawn to show the inheritance. That will be fine. Alright, so that is the answer for that. Now it says create an example Java class for prescription showing the use of default and overloaded constructors. So how do you do that? You do that by creating a separate class called prescription class in the NetBeans or Java class separately on wherever you are doing, and include these details in the prescription. See, prescription ID, patient ID. You have to have all the getters and setters as well. That's something you have to remember to include. And then the toString method, it is asking you to give the toString method, so you have to create those details. So everything here, in addition to that, all the methods, all the constructors, and also overloaded constructor, default constructor, and also toString method. Okay, so it's not asking you to create the entire hierarchy, it's just asking you to create this prescription class alone. Alright, and then if the prescriptions are saved as an array list. So now that you have the prescription class, it's not related to any of these things, you see. So it says here, if you are given the prescription class as an array list, show how you will add the prescriptions to such an array list after creating one. Yeah, so basically you have to have the prescription. So this is not just inheritance, it asks you to create other details. So you'll create an array list of all the, first of all, this is how the array list will look like. Prescriptions, right? Prescription, use the prescription class, and you will have list, or you can have, this is for a specific patient actually, right? Prescription. So look at the prescription class, it has this thing called patient ID. So every prescription belongs to a specific patient. So you have a list of prescription. In the database it will be the prescription table actually. So prescription has this prescription equal new array list, and then you'll give again actually you can't use the class name, so you have to say prescription using the class name prescription list. All the prescriptions are there, array list, and give the prescription. So this is use of Java generics prescription to create this. There you have a prescription list. Then you will create a new prescription using the, sorry about that, you'll just say prescription capital P, class names are capital if you have read that way. Prescription, one prescription example, example equal new prescription, and remember you have to have the order constructor created. So the, or if you have created order constructor, some data will go in here, right? Because you have to give those data, and based on your class you can give them. Then you can say prescription, this is my array list dot add. This is how you add it, right? Example. So it's just, that is what it is asking for. So 5 marks here in order to create this, to correctly create this. Remember, in the exam you have to, in the answer you actually have to show what will be here. I'm just giving them, and here you have to add this part also into the list. That's how you add an array list into the list. Okay, if we are to create a function in the prescription class, you see in the prescription class we have, if we are to create a function to return an array list of prescriptions that belong to a specific patient, you know. So let's say in the prescription class you are going to have many prescriptions, like, and the same patient is going to have many prescriptions, isn't it? So you are going to return all the prescription for a specific patient. How such a function would look like? Make sure to have a method header that could identify the patient to be returned. So in this case you need to have the patient class, patient prescription class, and there you have to create the function to return an array list. So that's not really related to the inheritance again. So we will do this in a separate session where we will create the whole prescription class and also implement this function. Then you have this question that says here, let's assume there is a specialty called neurology. So how do you know the specialty? Here in the doctors class you have the specialty, see. So let's assume that there is a specialty called neurology. Write a function that could exist in the doctors class. Now remember, the question asks you to create just the function, so you don't need to create the whole hierarchy. You should know how the hierarchy will look like in your mind, okay, without creating them. And if it doesn't help, of course you have to create them, right? If it doesn't help, you have to create them in order to get on this question. Write a function that could exist in the doctors class where it would accept the list of all the doctors in an array list and print the name and room number of all the doctors with a given specialty. So you have to create a function, and into the function it will accept all the doctors list. So it will have all the doctors. What are all the doctors? Okay, give me a list of all the doctors in the array list, and then from the doctors it will check the given, you see, the given specialty. So in this case you are given neurology when you are calling the function. So in the function you have to have a general string that identifies what is the specialty. In this case specialty is a string, and then you are giving that string as neurology. Then you will compare this against neurology, and if it is neurology you will print it out, right? You are not going to print it out, of course, are you? That could exist in the doctors where it would accept a list of and print the name. See, it will just print the name and room number of the doctors in that specialty. Okay, so how you can do that, right? So this also we will do it separately. So we will make a separate session where we will actually do the whole tutorial including this hierarchy in a guide for you to help you understand inheritance as well as understand this question to answer them. Okay, so basically the tutorial, main part of the tutorial is how do you come up with this one. Okay, thank you very much. For that's it for this session. I will make a separate session about the prescription class and the doctors class.